The sun was setting over the busy streets of downtown. The city was alive with the usual hustle and bustle, cars honking, pedestrians rushing by, and the distant hum of street vendors calling out to the crowds. But amidst all this noise, there was a stillness in the air. It was the kind of stillness that only came when something felt off. In the midst of the urban chaos, Officer Danny sat in his patrol car, his hands gripping the wheel with a mixture of frustration and unease. His uniform was crisp, but his posture was stiff, his eyes narrowed in irritation as he surveyed the streets. This wasn't the part of the city he enjoyed patrolling. "Why am I stuck here?" he muttered under his breath, his gaze darting to the nearby block, a predominantly black neighborhood. His jaw tightened as he watched the crowds moving through the streets, his mind filled with stereotypes and assumptions he couldn't quite shake off. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His patrol area wasn't ideal, but it was his job. And deep down, he knew it would be an uneventful shift, or at least that's what he was hoping. But his unease never quite went away, especially in this part of the city. The people around here made him feel out of place. He tried to shake the thought, but the tension stayed. As he checked his rearview mirror, he noticed a car weaving through traffic in the lane next to him. It was an old sedan, not in the best shape. Mary, the driver, sat behind the wheel, her expression calm and focused. Despite the day's exhaustion written on her face, there was a confidence about her. She had seen this city, felt its weight, and learned to navigate it. Mary's life had never been easy. She was a single mother, struggling to balance the pressures of work, raising her kids, and making ends meet. The weight of her responsibilities was visible in the way her brow furrowed slightly as she adjusted her grip on the steering wheel. Yet despite the daily grind, she had a quiet strength to her. She had to. For her children. Mary's gaze was steady, though her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts were with her son, who had a school project to finish by tomorrow, and her daughter, who needed new shoes for the upcoming school dance. She was tired, but she would do what she had to do to keep her family afloat. As she drove, she couldn't help but glance at the corner of the street where Officer Danny's patrol car was parked. It wasn't the first time she had noticed him there, his eyes lingering on the street and the people around. She had seen that look before, the kind of judgment that didn't need to be said aloud. But today it was different. Today it wasn't just a stare. As if on cue, Danny pulled out from the curb and began tailing her car, his headlights reflecting off her rearview mirror. She instinctively knew what this meant. She sighed. "Here we go again," she muttered under her breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had been pulled over before, more times than she cared to admit, and it was always the same. She knew the routine, the questions, the judgment. But there was something else in the air today, something heavier than usual. Officer Danny's car stayed just behind her, keeping a close distance. He was calculating, watching. His thoughts were far from professional. His mind was clouded with biases that had been built up over years of policing a community he didn't understand. As he followed her, he already assumed he knew who she was, what she represented. His fingers twitched on the steering wheel, ready to make a move. "Let's see what this one's up to," he thought. It wasn't just about following the law, it was about maintaining control. And he was in charge here. Meanwhile, Mary's heart beat just a little faster as she turned onto a quieter side street. She had seen him now and she knew the drill. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror once more, she could see the look in his eyes, not one of professionalism, but of something deeper, something darker. It was a moment of unease. Little did she know, this ordinary evening would take a turn that neither of them could have predicted. Mary's car slowed as she approached the intersection, the bright red light signaling her to stop. The streets were packed with traffic, everyone just trying to get home after a long day. She exhaled, drumming her fingers lightly on the steering wheel, the rhythm calming her nerves. She glanced at the rearview mirror one more time, but her eyes narrowed when she saw Officer Danny's patrol car pull up behind her. His headlights were glaring in her mirror, like he was just waiting for an excuse. It wasn't the first time she had been pulled over. In fact, she was almost used to it now. The way some officers would act like they owned the streets, like they were above everyone else. She had been stopped before for small mistakes, like a broken taillight or an expired tag, and the way they treated her always felt personal. As the light stayed red, Mary tried to take deep breaths. She wasn't in the mood to argue today. She had a long list of things to do, and the last thing she needed was to get involved in another pointless encounter with the police. She turned her head toward the passenger seat, her son's school bag sitting there, forgotten for the moment. She'd need to check it later to make sure his homework was done. But just as the light turned green, she heard the unmistakable sound of the siren. The sudden flash of blue and red lights reflecting off her rearview mirror made her stomach drop. She had hoped to get away this time, but she knew the drill by now. She wasn't going to get away from it. With a sigh, Mary pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath her tires as she parked. She shifted the car into park and took a deep breath. She had to stay calm. Don't let him get under your skin. "Here we go," she whispered to herself, glancing at the clock. 5:30. Another hour to go before she could get home. The officer's footsteps approached her car, heavy and deliberate. She could feel his presence before he even reached the window. The moment he tapped on the window, Mary lowered it slowly, offering a polite but strained smile. "Good evening, ma'am," Danny said, his voice flat. He didn't introduce himself or offer any pleasantries. He just went straight into the routine. "License and registration, please." Mary fumbled with her purse, her fingers tracing the edges of her wallet. She could feel the officer's gaze on her, piercing through her with a cold judgment. She handed him the documents, trying not to make eye contact. It wasn't that she was afraid of him, she just didn't want to give him any reason to escalate the situation. He took the papers from her, inspecting them carefully. He then flipped to the back of the registration and held it up, scrutinizing it for a moment longer than needed. "Your registration is expired, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped and condescending. Mary blinked. "What? No, Expired," Danny repeated slowly, almost as if he was enjoying the power. "You should have gotten that fixed already." Mary's heart dropped, and a wave of frustration washed over her. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I've been busy with my kids." She started to explain, but Danny cut her off. "Yeah, well, it's not my problem, is it? You should have been more responsible." His words were laced with thinly veiled disdain. She could feel the weight of the moment dragging on. "I'll fix it. I'll pay the fine. I'm just trying to get home." Danny didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at her for a long moment, as if studying her. "Sure you will," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let's be honest here. People like you always make excuses, don't you?" Mary's breath caught in her chest. Her first instinct was to snap back at him, to ask him what he meant by that, but she held herself back. "Stay calm, Mary. Don't let him win." She clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart pounding in her chest. Danny smirked, leaning down slightly, his face just inches from hers. "You know exactly what I mean." His eyes scanned her face with a look of superiority. "You people always seem to think the rules don't apply to you." Her blood ran cold. She had heard this kind of talk before, but never quite so blatant. "You're gonna arrest me for expired registration? Really?" Mary's voice shook slightly, but she refused to back down. "You want to make this an issue?" Danny asked, his voice sharp. "I can. I'm sure your kind has plenty of excuses, but the law is the law." Mary's chest tightened. Her throat felt dry, and she tried to swallow the lump that had formed there. But instead of reacting in anger, she took a slow, controlled breath. She needed to keep this civil, no matter how hard it was. "I'm not making excuses," she said, her voice cold now. "I'm just trying to get home." Danny raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "Sure you are. I bet you've got a lot of important things to get back to." Her jaw clenched. She could feel the anger building inside her, but she forced it down. There was no point in arguing with him. He wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind about her. Suddenly, before she could say anything more, there was a loud crack of gunfire in the distance. Danny's head snapped up, his posture immediately shifting as he looked toward the sound. More shots rang out. People on the street scattered, shouting in panic. Danny's eyes widened in realization. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking toward a van parked on the opposite side of the street. The vehicle's windows were tinted, and it looked suspiciously out of place in this neighborhood. Before he could react, another round of shots echoed in the distance. The chaos seemed to erupt out of nowhere. Sirens blared, screams filled the air. People ran for cover, ducking behind cars and buildings. Danny, momentarily stunned, looked back at Mary, his expression now a mix of confusion and fear. "Stay in the car," he snapped, his voice now urgent. Mary didn't wait for him to finish. Her eyes darted to the van, the scene unfolding in front of her. She could see the gunmen moving quickly, heading toward a nearby alley. She didn't think. She just acted. The next few moments happened in a blur. As the officers nearby scrambled to respond, Mary made a decision. With one quick look at Danny, she slammed the car into drive and gunned the engine. The tires screeched as she raced toward the van, her car veering dangerously close to the gunman. Danny was still shouting at her, but the sound of his voice faded as she sped through the chaos. In that moment, everything became clear. She wasn't just trying to survive the day anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. As she sped toward the danger, she didn't hesitate. She wasn't going to let a badge, a gun, or a racist attitude stop her. She slammed the brakes just in time to hit the van, sending it careening toward the alley. The gunmen were taken by surprise, momentarily disoriented. It was enough. Officer Danny stood frozen for a moment, staring at the chaos unfolding before him. He had no choice but to rethink everything. It was too late for him to act now. The chaos in the streets was deafening, but Officer Danny was no longer paying attention to the fleeing crowd or the screams echoing through the alley. His adrenaline had kicked in. The earlier moment of uncertainty had faded into a rush of overconfidence. As police sirens wailed in the distance, he turned his focus to the van parked across the street, the same one that had drawn everyone's attention moments earlier. Something about it seemed wrong. It wasn't just the way it stood there, strangely idle in a neighborhood where it didn't belong. It was the men who'd stepped out from behind it. Danny had seen that kind of posture before, the kind of readiness that only comes from experience. The gunshots had stopped for a few seconds, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officers were scrambling to coordinate backup, but Danny didn't wait. He was already out of his patrol car, hand on his holster, his jaw set with a determination that betrayed the underlying recklessness. "I'll handle it myself," he muttered to no one in particular, feeling a surge of misplaced confidence. He had been a cop for years. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't his first chase or confrontation. He'd dealt with worse. He didn't wait for backup. He never did. After all, he was the one with the badge. As he moved toward the van, his boots hitting the cracked pavement with purpose, Danny pushed aside the voice of caution that whispered in the back of his mind. He ignored the flashing warning signs, the fact that the street was eerily empty now, the way the air seemed too still. "It's just a few punks," he thought, dismissing the growing sense of dread in his chest. Without a second thought, he crossed the distance between the curb and the van, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. His mind was already racing through the procedures, but the arrogance clouding his judgment made him blind to the most important one. Never approach a suspicious vehicle without backup. He reached the side of the van, the metallic door looming in front of him. Before he could get his bearings, the side door slammed open. The sound of the hinges scraping against the pavement was sharp, cutting through the thick air. Danny's hand shot up to his gun, but it was too late. 3 men, dark clothing, masks, and weapons drawn, emerged from the shadows of the van. Danny froze for a split second, his training and instincts fighting with his ego. He raised his gun, his voice trembling with authority. "Stop right there!" he shouted. But the men didn't hesitate. In an instant, one of them fired a shot, the bullet whizzing past Danny's ear with an ear-splitting crack. His heart skipped a beat as the second man lunged forward, knocking the gun from Danny's hands. It all happened too fast. Danny was out of his depth. Panic began to surge through him. "Back up now!" he screamed into his radio. But the transmission was drowned out by another gunshot and the sound of a second man coming closer. Danny had underestimated the situation. He had walked straight into a trap, and now he was paying the price. Back on the street, Mary, who had already started to drive away after her own harrowing moment with Officer Danny, heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Pop! 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 3 shots, each more urgent than the last. Her stomach dropped. She recognized the direction from which the shots came. It was the same street where she had seen Danny stop her. She slammed her foot on the brake, the car jerking to a halt. The officer, the same man who had treated her like dirt just moments ago, was in danger. Mary hesitated for only a second. It was easy to justify driving away. She didn't owe Danny anything. After all, he had humiliated her earlier, had tried to make her feel small and powerless. But something inside her stopped her from driving away. She couldn't ignore what was happening. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. She wasn't about to let him die, not after all the unfairness she'd already dealt with in this world. But this was different. This wasn't about him. This was about saving a life. Mary knew that the alley leading to where Danny was stood was only a block away. Instinct kicked in. Without thinking, she pulled the wheel hard to the left, spinning her car around with tires screeching against the road. She wasn't sure why she was doing this. Maybe it was her survival instincts from growing up in tough neighborhoods. Maybe it was just the right thing to do. But whatever it was, her body moved before her mind had the chance to catch up. Her car shot forward, straight toward the chaos. As she neared the scene, Mary saw Danny, now backed into a corner by 2 of the men. His hands were raised, trying to block off their guns, his movements wild, desperate. His face was pale, and the arrogance that had been so evident earlier was gone, replaced by a look of sheer terror. "Move!" Mary shouted to herself. She didn't have a moment to waste. In an instant, she slammed her foot back on the gas, pushing the car faster. The tires screamed against the pavement as she aimed directly for one of the gunmen, who was standing closest to Danny. The man didn't even see her coming until it was too late. With a violent crash, Mary's car collided with him, knocking him off his feet and sending him flying into the side of the van. The other 2 men turned in shock, but by then Mary was already spinning the wheel, getting the car into position. Danny's eyes widened as he saw her approach. He couldn't believe it. This was the same woman he had treated with contempt only moments before, and now she was risking her life to save his. In the chaos, one of the attackers took a step back, aiming his gun at Danny. Mary didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot down again, the car surging forward just in time to knock the attacker's gun hand away. The car's side hit the man squarely, knocking him off balance. He stumbled backward, crashing into the streetlight. The third man, realizing he was outnumbered and outgunned, took a few steps back, trying to assess the situation. He wasn't ready to fight anymore. His retreating footsteps were drowned out by the sound of the distant sirens. He knew that help was on the way. Danny, now free from the immediate threat, stood there, panting and disoriented. His heart was still racing, and his hands shook as he tried to regain control of his senses. He looked over at Mary, who was now standing outside her car, eyes scanning the alley for any further danger. For the first time in what felt like forever, Danny realized he had been wrong. All the years of preconceptions, all the assumptions about people like Mary, had led him to this moment. She had saved his life. Danny's voice cracked, but before he could say anything more, Mary shook her head. Save it. Her voice was firm, but there was no anger in it. Just do your job. She turned her back on him, walking back to her car. She had done enough. The dust was beginning to settle as the sound of sirens filled the street. Officers rushed to the scene, taking control of the chaotic aftermath. The gunman had been apprehended, the van searched, and the area was slowly returning to its usual state. But for Officer Danny, nothing felt normal anymore. His heart was still pounding and his mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Mary had saved his life. Her, the same woman he had treated with such disdain, the one he had judged and stereotyped without a second thought. She had put herself in danger to help him, without hesitation or remorse. He watched as she walked away from the scene, her steps confident and unwavering. She didn't look back. She didn't wait for any acknowledgement from him. And as much as Danny wanted to call out to her, to apologize, to explain, he knew he had no right to do any of that. Not now. Not after everything that had passed between them. Instead, he stood there, feeling a deep embarrassment settle in his chest. The moment she had knocked down one of the attackers with her car, saving him in the process, he had seen himself for what he truly was, a man full of assumptions, arrogance, and unearned superiority. He had seen his own hypocrisy reflected in her actions, and it stung more than any bullet could have. Mary didn't need his gratitude. She didn't need his apology. She had done what needed to be done. She had acted on instinct, and her actions had spoken louder than any words ever could, but Danny still felt the weight of the situation. What the hell have I done? He thought, running a hand through his hair. He looked back toward Mary's car, which had already driven off into the night. How could I have been so blind? The following day, Danny sat at his desk in the precinct, staring at a report in front of him. His eyes were fixed on a single name, Mary Williams. He had seen her name before countless times, on paperwork, on traffic tickets, in case files. But now it felt different. Now it was personal. She was no longer just another statistic. She wasn't just a person of interest or a suspect in his eyes. She was a human being, someone who had saved his life, and he had no idea what kind of person she was beyond the judgment he had made in the past. He couldn't stop thinking about the way she had stepped up in the face of danger without a second thought for herself. How could he have treated her like that? How could he have looked at her, looked at people like her, as though they were beneath him, as though their struggles didn't matter? As though they didn't have the strength and dignity to make a difference? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The arrogance that had driven him all these years, the prejudice that had shaped his views, had been blinding him. It had blinded him to the reality of the world around him, to the real people he was supposed to be protecting. He had let his own biases dictate his actions. And in doing so, he had alienated people who might have had more in common with him than he cared to admit. For the first time in years, Danny felt small. He sat in silence for a long moment, his mind racing. He thought about the things he had said to Mary, the insults, the assumption that she was just another careless person in the world. He thought about how she had reacted to him, how she had kept her composure even when he had pushed her to the edge. And he thought about the way she had left him, without a single word of thanks or anger, just walking away as though he wasn't even worth her time. He deserved that. He had treated her like dirt, and in the end, she had shown him the kind of person he needed to be. But now, what? What did this change mean for him? How could he fix the damage he had done? He had no answers. Later that afternoon, as Danny was finishing his shift, he walked past the precinct's break room where a few officers were chatting. He overheard them talking about the incident from last night. They were praising Mary's actions, calling her a hero, and recounting how she had saved the day. One of the officers joked, "I don't think any of us would have gone in there without backup, but Mary?" She didn't hesitate. She saved Danny's life. Can you believe that? The others laughed, but there was a hint of respect in their voices. Danny felt a twinge of guilt. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't fully understand what had happened, that they didn't see how much he had changed or how his entire view of the world had shifted. But maybe that was okay. Maybe this wasn't something he needed to announce to the world. Maybe the change had to come from within. He found his locker, took out his jacket, and slung it over his shoulder. He felt like a different man, but there was still a long way to go. As he walked toward the exit, he caught sight of Mary's name once again, this time on a missing persons poster on the wall. It wasn't anything new. Her name was just one of many faces that filled the bulletin board. But something about it struck him differently today. He didn't know what her life was like beyond the traffic stops and the tense encounters. He didn't know what struggles she had faced or what battles she fought every day. But now, he wanted to know. He wanted to listen. And more importantly, he wanted to understand. He was starting to realize that understanding wasn't just about keeping people safe. It was about seeing them as equals, seeing them as people, not as labels or assumptions. Danny walked out of the precinct doors, the cold air hitting his face. He paused for a moment, standing in the quiet evening. His thoughts were racing, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't clouded by the prejudices of his past. Maybe this is how I start, he thought, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Change never was. But Danny knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to keep living in the same way he had been. And somewhere out there, Mary was driving home, her life moving forward without the weight of his mistakes on her shoulders. But for Danny, this was the moment of his own reckoning. And though the story didn't have an easy conclusion, he had already taken the first step toward becoming a better version of himself. The evening sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue across the city streets. Mary walked down the sidewalk, her pace steady, her shoulders squared. The world around her buzzed with the usual noise of urban life, cars honking, distant conversations, the shuffle of footsteps. But she felt like she was in her own little bubble, separate from it all. She didn't look back. After everything that had happened, after the gunshots and the chaos and the unexpected heroism, she had simply done what she always did. She'd kept moving. You can't stop. You can't afford to, she thought, pushing through the exhaustion. Her mind was already ahead, to the next task, to the next struggle. The day's events had been intense, but they had also shown her something she hadn't quite expected. She was stronger than she thought. A year ago, she might have hesitated. A year ago, if someone had told her she would risk her life for someone like Danny, she might have laughed. But today, it wasn't about him. It wasn't about the badge he wore or the mistakes he'd made. It was about her. It was about the decision she made when it mattered most. As she walked, she could hear the distant wail of sirens still echoing through the streets. The city had gone back to its usual pace, but she knew it had all changed, at least for her. She had taken a stand, not because it was easy or because she owed anyone anything, but because she understood what it meant to fight when no one else would. Her life hadn't been easy. It hadn't been fair. But what she had learned over the years, what had shaped her, was this. No one should ever be underestimated. Not by anyone. Not by men like Danny. Not by society. Not by the system that was supposed to protect her, but more often than not, overlooked her. The police sirens slowly faded behind her, and she took a deep breath. She had made it through another day. There was a quiet strength in that, a resilience that burned brighter than any of the chaos that had unfolded. As Mary continued her walk down the street, she passed by a small cafe with a chalkboard sign outside. "Free coffee for first responders," it read. It was the kind of sign that a week ago might have made her pause and wonder if the world was ever going to change for people like her. But now she just kept walking, her eyes fixed forward. She didn't need to stop. Not anymore. She knew what she was capable of, even when the world tried to remind her that she was just another face in the crowd. She wasn't just anyone. She was Mary Williams, a woman who had faced life's hardest punches and kept going. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from her sister. "How'd it go with that cop? You good?" She smiled to herself and typed back quickly, "I'm good. I'm always good." And as she hit send, she paused, looking out at the street ahead. There was something different about her today. A clarity, a sense of purpose. The weight she had carried for so long, of always being judged, always being seen as less, had lightened. She wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. The light turned green, and she crossed the street, her stride purposeful. She passed by a group of kids playing basketball on the corner, their laughter filling the air. She nodded at them, the kind of small gesture that had always felt like a silent battle cry. They didn't know her story, but they would remember her. They'd remember that she had done what others were afraid to do, and that was enough. As Mary turned the corner toward her apartment, she felt a strange weightlessness, as though she had been carrying a heavy load for so long that the pressure was finally starting to ease. The truth was, she didn't need anyone's validation. She didn't need to wait for Danny's apology or for society to recognize her. She knew her worth, and that was enough. More than enough. Back at the precinct, Danny sat alone in his car, parked outside. He had gone through his paperwork, finished his shift, but something in him had been left undone. He kept replaying the scene from last night, the way Mary had acted, the way she had so effortlessly taken control of the situation. He kept wondering, could he ever be like that? Could he ever be someone who just did what was right without hesitation, without needing to prove anything to anyone? He thought about the times he had looked at people like Mary with judgment. How many others like her had he written off? How many had he dismissed as not worth his time, just because they didn't fit the mold he had in his mind? He didn't have answers, but something was changing inside him, something that had been buried deep down, covered by the weight of his uniform and his pride. And while he didn't know where this path would lead him, he was starting to understand that the journey would take him places he hadn't yet imagined. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of that. As Mary reached her building, she stopped for a moment, looking up at the evening sky. The stars had started to appear, faint and distant, but still visible. She hadn't changed the world today. She hadn't even changed Danny's whole life. But maybe, just maybe, she had changed something. She entered the building, climbing the stairs two at a time, her hand gripping the railing. Her life wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she knew one thing for certain. She was going to be just fine. Inside her apartment, she tossed her keys onto the counter and went straight to the small window by the kitchen. She gazed out at the city, the lights twinkling below like 1,000 little stars of their own. Her eyes were sharp and clear now, no longer clouded by doubt. She had walked into danger without thinking twice, had put herself on the line for someone who had made her feel small. But she hadn't walked away small. She had walked away stronger. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a friend. "You okay? Heard about the officer?" She didn't even have to think about it. Her fingers tapped the keys quickly. "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm more than okay." And as she hit send, she smiled to herself, a little laugh escaping her lips. Mary Williams didn't need anyone's approval. She had everything she needed right here: the strength to stand tall, the courage to face whatever came next, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that no one, no matter their badge, their uniform, or their assumptions, could ever hold her back.